El día de hoy tenemos como invitado al doctor David Rheinheimer. I hope I say right your last name. Y nos va a estar hablando sobre el tema de operacionalización de flujos ambientales. Ahorita pues va a quedar más claro a qué se refiere ese término. El doctor David Rheinheimer tiene un doctorado en Water Resource Engineering de la Universidad de California Davis y pues hizo su maestría en Ingeniería Ambiental en la Universidad de California, pero en Berkeley, y su formación profesional es ingeniero civil de la Universidad de Massachusetts. Actualmente es un investigador asociado en la Escuela de Ingeniería de la Universidad de California en Merced y pues también está como un fellow investigador en el grupo de investigación en hidrosistemas de la Universidad de Massachusetts. Y pues bueno, en su currículum lo vamos a hacer disponible, si es que no ya lo tenían en la invitación, pues tiene ahí varias publicaciones a nivel internacional, conferencias y capítulos de libros y demás productividad ahí como investigador. Entonces, please welcome Dr. David Rheinheimer.
Thank you. Is this okay? This works. Okay, yeah, thank you, Enrico. I'm just going to do two things before I start. One is I'm going to take off my jacket. I did want to show that I'm making a great presentation here, but it is hot. I'm also going to grab some water that I brought with me, which I forgot to bring to the podium. Hopefully that works. Yeah, thank you, Enrique, and it's great to be here. I love tech. I've been here like several times at this point, and it's great to be speaking here somewhat formally. So I'd like to talk about operationalizing environmental flows, trends, trade-offs, and future research needs. I'm going to adjust this so that. And really the idea is to talk about environmental flows and what my research interests are in environmental flows. So the general outline of this is I'd like to talk about environmental flows, science, and trends. And this is going to be more a lecture. I'm not really doing research in environmental flows themselves, but I'd like to talk about the science and practice, et cetera, because to me that's very interesting. And it drives a lot of the work that I do in engineering and systems analysis. Then I'd like to talk about the trade-offs assessments that I've done personally in my own research with systems analysis. I'll talk about systems analysis and environmental flows and explore a couple of trade-off studies that I've done in my research. And then I'll talk about some of what I see some of the critical future research needs are in this field, at least from my perspective. And that's, you can think of that sort of as my own research agenda, what I'm thinking about and what I'd like to do in the future. And then I'll summarize with some key points. About myself, Enrique did a great job of introducing. I'd like to point out that I have worked for, in addition to the academic credentials, I've worked for the US government doing environmental remediation projects. I've worked for NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, updating nautical charts, so that's really mapping GIS experience. I worked with the World Wildlife Fund, developing this product HydroSheds, if you're familiar with it. That's a global hydrography DEM data set. And it was with the World Wildlife Fund that I really got interested in environmental flows and this question of, how can we better understand environmental flows and what can we actually do to implement environmental flows? And then since my PhD, I've done postdoctoral research in California, China, India, Mexico here at Tech, and then now in Massachusetts. So what are environmental flows? First of all, before I talk about environmental flows specifically, I want to give you some key readings in this. So if this were a class, this would be your homework assignment. In fact, this book here would be the main text I would use. First of all, the Brisbane Declaration in 2007, and the Brisbane Declaration on Environmental Flows, 2018. The first Brisbane Declaration in 2007. This was in Brisbane, every year in Brisbane, Australia. Most years in Brisbane, Australia, there is what's called the River Symposium. River Symposium is a global conference on rivers, river management, et cetera. There was a declaration in 2017, which was kind of a communique talking about really why environmental flows are important and what should the global agenda be on environmental flows. And then that was followed up a decade later in 2018, very recently, to just follow up on that original declaration. That's very important original reading. And then this book came out a couple years ago, 2017, Water for the Environment, From Policy and Science to Implementation and Management. This is a comprehensive edited book with contributing chapters by a wide range of experts in the field on managing water for the environment. And one of the reasons that I'm so excited about this book is that my name is in there. I wrote a chapter on tools for sediment management in rivers. You can see my name is there with one of my colleagues from UC Davis, Dr. Sarah Yarnell. You'll see her name pop up occasionally in here as well. Interestingly, my area of expertise is not sediment management, but I'm interested in the field enough to be able to pull together and synthesize, information as needed. Excuse me. So who uses rivers? Rivers are very important for a bunch of different reasons. We have a wide range of diverse interests that depend on rivers, including for urban users for a bunch of different uses within the urban regions, right? Hydropower, agriculture, fisheries, aquaculture, ecosystems. We have indigenous and cultural uses as well. We have tourism, recreation, navigation, et cetera. Many of these have competing objectives, and not all of them are ecologically sustainable, right? So if you think about navigation, for example, ships want a very smooth, consistent river. Fish don't, right? So many of these objectives are competing. Why provide water to the environment, right? So if we look at all those different uses of rivers, from ecosystems to cultural uses to navigation, why focus on the environment, right? Well, healthy rivers provide what are called ecosystem services, right? Ecosystem services are specific, identifiable services that really benefit people and species, right? Ecosystem services, or rivers generally, provide economic security, in terms of fisheries, in terms of medicines, timber, et cetera. They provide social security in terms of flood reduction, right? If we look at a river before development and then post-development, pre-development, we see that forests and rivers have a way of reducing floods, if not eliminating them entirely, whereas after development, we see floods are much more powerful than they used to be. We see this here in Monterey, certainly. Back in, I think it was 2005, I forget the name of the hurricane. Hurricane Ivan, was that right? In Monterey. So the development here in Monterey has exacerbated flooding within the city as a result of the urban development, right? Whereas if we provide water to the environment and also arrange our river infrastructure in such a way that it is more natural and more suitable for natural ecosystems, that can reduce some of that flooding. And there's also ethical security as well. We should be protecting the rights of people and species to water that they have historically depended on. And there is some ethical theory and background associated with that, which I'm not really an expert in. So some of the motivating questions that come out of this, is, from my perspective, are, how should we manage rivers to support both healthy river ecosystems and our own human well-being? Given this wide range of human values and interests, and also this continually evolving knowledge and tool set that we have at our disposal, right? In addition, how should any particular river be managed or engineered? Each particular river, even though we have these universal paradigms, these universal scientific approaches, every single river is different, right? So when we go from one river to the next, especially if it's in a different part of the world, a different climate zone, a different social context, the nuances of managing that river are going to be completely different than that other basin. What knowledge tools already exist to facilitate making better natural resources management decisions? This is not only for rivers, but natural resources in general. So this could be food, this could be energy, et cetera. How can we improve our knowledge and tools that needed to make better environmental management decisions now and in the future? Did I miss one there? Yeah, this is the critical slide, actually. So environmental flows, what are environmental flows? Environmental flows, different organizations define environmental flows differently. This is from the Brisbane Declaration that I mentioned, the more recent one from 2018. Environmental flows describe the quantity, timing, and quality of freshwater flows and levels necessary to sustain aquatic ecosystems, which in turn support human cultures, economies, sustainable livelihoods, and well-being, right? And I do want to focus on this a little bit. The first part, environmental flows describes the quantity, timing, and quality of freshwater flows. So this is the quantity, how much water, the timing, when does that water occur within the year, or even within the hour, and then the quality of freshwater flows, right? And so the quality is, we're not talking about volume, we're not talking about the H2O, we're also talking about sediment, temperature, nutrients within the river, wood, other aspects of the river as well. And freshwater flows. We are talking about rivers and lakes here. We're not talking about oceans. Necessary to sustain aquatic ecosystems. Environmental flows are decidedly for ecosystems. Even though we say that they're for human benefit ultimately, we are looking immediately to provide water for ecosystems. However, after that, these in turn support humans and support our own needs, our own cultures, our own livelihoods, our own economies, et cetera, right? There are many, again, this is from the Brisbane Declaration, there are many related terms associated with this, which are described in that book, Water for the Environment, which I recommend. The natural flow regime, this is a seminal paper and a seminal idea so this was a paper that was written in 1997, and the reason I mention this is kind of an essential paper in reading environmental flows. So any major important environmental flows paper is going to cite this paper, right? This is a paradigm for river conservation and restoration. This is written by Leroy Poff at the University of Colorado, Fort Collins in Colorado, and his colleagues in other parts of the world. The basic idea here is that the ecological integrity of river systems, of river ecosystems, depends on their naturally dynamic character, right? So the flow regime, which consists of the magnitude, frequency, duration, timing, and rate of change of flow within the river, affects the ecological integrity of that river, right? It can either affect it directly. I mean, there are some species that receive their life cycle cues directly from the flow regime itself, but this connection is also mediated through water quality, which I mentioned, energy sources, carbon, detritus in the river itself, the physical habitat is the rocks, the wood, the shape of the riverbed, and then biotic interactions, right? There are multiple species in this river. Biotic interactions, big fish eat smaller fish, and those smaller fish eat insects. Those insects might eat little, there's this whole food chain. And then you have bears, eating the salmon, right? So those biotic interactions are important. So the basic premise of the natural flow regime is that alteration of the natural flow regime also alters the ecological integrity of the river through interruptions of water quality, energy sources, physical habitat, and biotic interactions, and the flow regime itself. Conversely, improving the ecological integrity of a river requires management of the flow regime. And this is critical. So if we want to improve the ecological integrity of a river, it is critical that we look at the flow regime and improve the flow regime through environmental flows to improve the ecological integrity. However, there is a big however here. These may be altered through non-flow mechanisms as well, right? These here. And so management of the flow regime is necessary but insufficient to managing the ecological integrity of rivers. So in managing the river ecosystems, we also have to look at these other aspects of the river as well, right? I wanted to show you a slide from a different paper, actually, Bunn and Arthington, 2002, which shows you the importance of the natural flow regime in a graphic form, right? And there are various principles associated with this paper that I won't get into. Generally, the point, though, is that each of these components of the natural flow regime have some ecological benefit, right? These range from life history patterns, spawning, recruitment, channel form, habitat complexity, et cetera, to natural to principles such as the natural regime discourages invasions. I won't get into the biology here, but the point is that each of these components has some relation to these various natural ecosystem processes, right? Another thing that I wanted to point out here was that the components of the natural flow regime, I mentioned the magnitude, duration, timing, frequency, rate of change. These are all depicted in here as well, although not explicitly. If we look at the timing, for example, when this peak flow occurs is represented by the timing. We talk about the magnitude, right? This can go up and down. We talk about the rate of change. The rate at which this hydrograph changes through time is what we mean when we say rate of change, right? I also mentioned that the flow regime itself is not the only part of the river that we're interested in. So since the natural flow regime paper came out, there have been a bunch of other papers that came out related to these other aspects of the river, right? So we also talk about the thermal regime of rivers, right? And so Cassia et al. Is a good starting point for that. The natural sediment regime of rivers, right? And of course, water for the environment as another reading. If you go into this book, basically this book, the nice thing about it is it captures all of what I'm talking about, and it'll include these references. I just wanted to show you generally, this is again from Water for the Environment. This is the hydrologic cycle and hydrologic alteration. I just wanted to give you a general idea of the various ways that our human activities can alter the flow regime, right? One is through surface water impoundment and diversion, right? So we might put some diversion that will alter the flow regime. We might put some larger impoundment that will also affect the flow regime downstream of that location. Up here we see this might be an interbasin transfer, right? We might transfer water from one basin to the next, and that can bring new water into that basin, but it'll serve our immediate needs of, say, increased water supply, for example, but it will also affect the flow regime in that region. Further downstream with urbanization, we see altered surface drainage networks. We see groundwater extraction and depletion. This can affect the flow regime. And then we also have alteration to the land surface water balance. I want to take a step back and show you globally why this is important. I like this figure. This shows, this is from a paper called The Global Boom in Hydropower Dam Construction. This shows globally, back in 2015, or thereabouts, dams that are under construction globally, or dams that are planned, right? So the blue dots represent dams that are under construction. The red dots represent dams that are planned, right? There are a heck of a lot of dams being planned throughout the world, right? So when we talk about alterations to the flow regime and to the integrity of aquatic ecosystems and therefore the ecosystem services that we depend on, that is happening all over the world. It's happened in the United States already. Notice that there are no blue or red dots here. It's because the United States has already been dammed to death, right? We're talking in the United States about removing dams and changing the way that dams are operated. In much of the rest of the world, especially the developing world, in southeastern Europe, in Turkey, in southern Asia, the Himalaya, in much of sub-Saharan Africa, in a large part of of Latin America, our own backyard here, Brazil, the western coast, et cetera. These are experiencing, or will experience, a major dam construction boom in the next few decades. So we really need to be thinking about these things proactively, in a global context, right? Going back to environmental flows, I'm going to dive in a little bit deeper. When we talk about implementing environmental flows, there are two ways that we can think about implementing environmental flows, very, very broadly. And then there are many more specific ways. One is through limiting alterations of abstractions from a river, right? To maintain some kind of natural flow baseline, or to maintain the biological and ecological integrity of a river that already exists in its natural form, right? This is really for keeping natural ecosystems as they already are, right? Another approach is to design flow regimes to achieve specific ecological and ecosystem service outcomes, right? And so these are for novel or hybrid ecosystems. And this would really be applicable when we're talking about managing a reservoir, for example. If we want to manage a reservoir to achieve a particular ecological outcome in the river below that reservoir or below that dam, we can think of that as designing a flow regime. And this is what Ackerman et al. 2014 call the designer paradigm, right? So river flows are designed for specific outcomes. And another important point here is that most of this talk assumes designer flows, but this is really more because I've been working in the United States and in California, where I mentioned that it's already, we've already tapped out our rivers. So in the United States in particular, we are really talking about reoperating reservoirs or changing the way that reservoirs are operated. And so we're necessarily talking about designer flows. And I won't go into this, but I did want to mention that there's this concept of environmental flow assessment methodologies, right? There are a wide range of ways, well, let me back up. The critical question is here, what should the managed flow regime look like, right? And so we have a wide range of different methods that have been developed and applied over the years to answer this question of how much water should we leave in the river, right? And these range in complexity from fairly simple, statistical approaches to what are called holistic methods. And really, the major difference between holistic methods and these other approaches, which focus more on hydraulics, hydraulic rating, habitat simulation, et cetera, is that these approaches have focused on single species, single target species, say a specific salmon or trout or whatever, at least in California. Whereas these holistic methods really focus on the entire river ecosystem. So they don't necessarily take this single myopic, single species approach, but rather look at the entire ecosystem. And so these holistic methods necessarily involve more people, they take longer time to implement, and they're more complex, and then there are other approaches as well. So each of these specific methods, with maybe the exception of the first one, I could spend an entire hour, if not weeks or year, focusing on these. I mean, if you look at any one particular method, like PHABSIM, for example, I won't explain what that is. There are people who spend their entire career focusing on developing and implementing that particular method. Now, I wanted to mention environmental flow requirements because this is a term that you often hear in environmental flows in managing rivers and managing reservoirs. IFRs implement environmental flows, right? So environmental flows is really about science and determining what we should release into the river or how we should manage it. And in-stream flow requirements are what the operator of a particular facility are required to release into the river, right? So environmental flows could include, for example, minimum and maximum in-stream flows, right? This is fairly obvious. The minimum and maximum allowable instantaneous flow in a river. This could be at a monthly time step or daily time step as well. The maximum ramping rate, and this could be up or down. So this is the maximum allowable rate of change from one time step to the next at a particular point. Remember I mentioned for the natural flow regime, we do have the rate of change as an important component of that. And then there might be some various other rules as well. A key thing that I want to point out is that not all IFRs support healthy ecosystems, and I'm going to show you that right now. Right? This is an IFR below New Spicer Meadow Reservoir in California. This is a Google Maps screenshot of it. You can see that it's it's not a huge reservoir, but it's not small either. It's not a simple diversion reservoir. If you look at the in-stream flow requirement below this dam, that's it, over on the right. It's a flat line. And think of the, what do you call it, the heart rate monitor. It goes up and down and up and down. What happens when your heart flatlines? It means you're dead. So when I see this, I think of, okay, well, this is probably, I don't know if the river is dead exactly, but it's not a natural, healthy ecosystem. There's probably fish in it, though, right? That like that kind of flow regime. On the other hand, this is spill management for Hetch Hetchy Reservoir, California. Hetch Hetchy is the main reservoir for supplying water to the city of San Francisco, right? If you look at the spill management regime, and I'm very familiar with this, by the way, the spill management regime, which they developed starting back in, let's say 5 years ago in 2014, they have gone through a rigorous process of developing a flow requirement, an in-stream flow requirement below the reservoir that depends on a wide range of factors that is shaped in a way that is really targeting specific aspects of the ecosystem as a whole. So, so whereas in the previous slide we saw a flat line, in this approach, they're using this functional flows approach where they are, which I'll talk about in a second, where they've really identified these ecosystem needs in this particular region below the reservoir and are shaping their hydrograph below this reservoir to meet those needs. I wanted to talk about this concept of functional flows. I mentioned this word designer flows, or this designer paradigm of functional flows, which came out a year later. Remember I mentioned Sarah Yarnell, she's a good colleague of mine. She developed this idea, she and her colleagues developed this idea of functional flows where these flows that we use to design a particular flow regime achieve a particular function, right? So there's this idea that as we gain more and more knowledge about river ecosystem science, we have a better scientific basis for shaping our flow regime to meet very specific ecological objectives so that we can design our river ecosystem in a way that we see fit according to that designer paradigm, right? But the functional flows implies that each of these flow components has some particular ecological objective. And that ecological objective may not be focused on the ecology immediately, it may be focused on reshaping the riverbed, for example, which is abiotic, but that has some biotic implication ultimately.
One more question.
Yeah.
On the slide, please. Can you pull up the slide again? Well, this clearly the functional flow regime emulates the natural flow, but it's all the time it's below the natural flow. So basically, you're approximating natural needs, but you're always below. It's of course kind of a compromise against what is politically possible to concede to the environment, or how is that done? Because, well, otherwise we would accept the interval over the year to be similar number, or seasonal, something like that. But clearly the total flow is not slower than the natural flow.
Yeah, so this goes back to, if you go back to that slide on designer flows, one of the things that I did not emphasize is the designer flow paradigm is for what are called novel ecosystems, right? So we can imagine that, no, we can't have the natural ecosystem in a particular river below dam. That's basically categorically impossible. But what we can do is we can design an ecosystem that is healthy, that is not natural, but that is healthy, that is, it may not exactly mimic that natural flow regime, but it is a lot more desirable than nothing, than a single species, right? What was that?
I guess you meet a certain threshold because natural flow may be surplus discharge, which is not necessarily beneficial to the ecosystem, or maybe even harmful, or is not required. So I would think that maybe the red line is kind of a threshold for certain species to survive. Is that the reasoning behind it?
Yeah, that's right. Well, the red line would be, I think it depends on the specific part of the hydrograph that you're talking about. I mean, you have to look at the hydrograph as a whole. But yeah, so this red line would be, well, again, I wouldn't think of it as a threshold. I would look at the whole thing and say, well, we have this complex system, and to be able to, well, we have this complex ecosystem that we want to be able to achieve, right? It may not be natural, the original natural, but it is something that we want to achieve, and this is what we need to do in the river to be able to achieve that, right? We need flows in this particular time of year because the fine sediments need to be washed out so the salmon can come later in the year and lay their eggs, but when the salmon come to lay their eggs, they need the flow regime to be quite a bit different, right? So it's looking at this and designing this, using the entire year's hydrograph to design that. And your other question, I think, is, that's more in the science of the ecology. I think that your other question is more about the politics and the trade-offs involved, and that's something that I'm a lot more interested in, which we can get into a little bit later on. But I'd love to talk more about that because I think that that's actually more critical. And so again, this is going back to the Upper Tuolumne program for Hetch-Hetchy. I just wanted to emphasize that functional flows concept is really what they're integrating there. Depending on the time of year, I think I'm repeating myself here, but they apply this functional flows concept so that each particular part of the flow regime that they're implementing below that dam has some overall purpose in meeting that overall ecosystem management objective, right? And so the other thing that I wanted to emphasize, and this is almost the end of the environmental flow science part, is I did want to emphasize the trends that we have seen in environmental flow science and implementation over the past few decades. And this is really for modern environmental water. If you look at those methods that I mentioned, or those methodologies that I mentioned a few slides back, some of them are more simple. Some of those simpler methods, which might say 10% of the mean natural flow, those were developed much earlier, back in, say, the 70s, if not the 50s. This is really starting from more like the mid-80s, 90s. Basically, we went from the 90s, this emergence and synthesis of environmental flows methods that had been developed independently in different parts of the world up until that time. And then as we go through the decades, we see a major expansion of what we mean by environmental flows and the people involved in making these environmental flows decisions and the organizations involved, et cetera. We also, I'm not going to go into this whole thing, but we do see, remember I mentioned the natural flow regime paradigm, that was back in 1997. As we move through the decades, the Brisbane Declaration, that was 10 years later. We saw the update to the Brisbane Declaration in 2018. One of the things that we've seen is the emergence of, or the recognition of climate change as a major factor that we should be considering in managing, well, all of our human endeavors and water management in particular, right? So that came to the fore. We talked about novel and hybrid ecosystems, right? That designer paradigm. So all these more, the science became deeper. We learned more about river ecosystems, and as we did so, we also recognized that the problem becomes more and more complex, right? To achieve sustainable rivers, we have to include all these different players who depend on rivers. And we also have to think about river management, not only from an ecosystem perspective and what's in the river, which, from a fish perspective is the most important thing. We also have to think about economy, politics. These are some of the things that you were alluding to. Governance and institutions, legal frameworks, ecology and science, the historical context, engineering, water markets, social values, et cetera, et cetera. It is not simply a matter of releasing water into a river. It's a matter of thinking about these much larger, organizational concepts. How do we want to manage our world, et cetera. Stationary is dead. With climate change and deep uncertainty, we're no longer talking about how do we manage a river based on historical observations. We have to think about long-term adaptation in managing these systems, right? So that's it for the environmental flows science. I'm going to kind of briefly go through what I've done. Just for the sake of time, I'd really rather focus on what I see some of the next major steps are and research needs. Systems analysis How many of you here are familiar with systems analysis as an engineering discipline? Okay, a couple of people, and I know some of you who haven't raised your hands also know a little bit about it. But, okay, well that's good. So systems analysis is really a mathematical approach to optimizing decisions for some operational objective, right? And so that operational objective could be, in a water supply system, for example, minimize water shortages. Everybody here is familiar with Monterey, and some of us may be familiar with the water shortages that Monterey is either currently experiencing or is currently fearful of experiencing in the near term, right? So we might develop some mathematical-based approach to representing the water supply system of Monterey, where that mathematical model could have an objective to minimize water shortages given a wide range of different constraints. Or in a hydropower system, that objective could be to maximize hydropower benefit. Or it could be to maximize hydropower generation or hydropower revenue. Or it could be to maximize the overall value of water deliveries for a wide range of different users, for water supply, hydropower, environment, et cetera. So we can use this systems analysis approach to mathematically model our water systems, including environmental flows, right? So systems analysis is widely used in water system planning and models for both simulation and optimization of these water systems. Just give me a second. And the typical form of these systems analysis approaches will be to minimize cost or minimize some function, which is going to be a function of cost, unit cost, say the value of 1 cubic meter of water in a particular location, and some decision variable. That decision variable will be, how much water to release from a reservoir, for example, how much water to deliver to a city, how much water to supply for ecosystems, right? Subject to various constraints. And so these constraints could be, for example, there can only be so much water held in a reservoir in any particular point in time. And so I'm not going to go into this. Well, I will a little bit later on. I just wanted to show you mathematically what a typical optimization problem looks like. So this is a typical systems analysis approach, where our objective is to maximize some function subject to various constraints in the system. There are a wide range of systems analysis or optimization methods that are out there in use. We have various hill climbing approaches where basically we have this hill, the top of this hill represents some optimal combination of decision variables at any particular point in time. A hill climbing approach will successively climb up this hill to find that optimum point at the top of that hill. We have meta-heuristic approaches, which are typically evolutionary algorithms, for example, genetic algorithm, if you've heard of that. This is useful where you have multiple local optimal points or peaks. A meta-heuristic approach will sample the entire decision space and usually converge on some globally optimal solution within that space. It won't necessarily find the most optimal point, but oftentimes in these problems, we're just interested in finding the general location of optimality. And then we have other methods as well, which I won't get into. So for environmental flows and systems analysis, these big questions that we need to think about are how do we integrate increasingly complex environmental flows into our systems analysis approaches, right? And how should systems analysis problems be framed? For example, maximizing benefit in a particular basin, for example, would imply assigning some kind of value to water for the environment comparable to, say, hydropower, right? So if we're going to use concepts of costs and benefits, if we're talking about hydropower systems and fish, we can put a cost or a benefit explicitly on hydropower. How do we make that comparison between hydropower ecosystem services? It's a very difficult challenge. So I leave this as a question mark, even though there are some methods to actually get at this question. How do we leverage systems analysis to identify optimal environmental flows? And so these are some of the big questions that I think about daily in my research. So I've done a few trade-off assessments related to this. I'm going to, I think, skip some of this and just tell you briefly what they were about. One, I looked at the Yangtze River below the Three Gorges Dam in China. Generally, the questions that I had were, what is the trade-off between natural flows, hydropower generation, and hydropower reliability? So I did one study using, actually skip this. I did one study using some kind of systems analysis approach, genetic algorithm in particular, where I looked at the environmental flow. I represented the environmental flow requirement mathematically below the reservoir. I looked at various performance metrics associated with managing the reservoir, including some kind of ecological performance metrics and two energy performance metrics. And I did some basic trade-off between each of these metrics, which are represented in value from 0 to 1, and this what I call k value. I didn't get into the mathematical details, but if we go from k equals 0 to k equal 1, we can think of k equals 0 as most ecologically degraded, to 1 being the natural flow regime in that particular river, right? And so we can see that represented in red and blue here. As we go from red, this represents k equals 0. As we increase k, we achieve a more and more natural-like flow regime below the reservoir. And the point of this is that as we do that sensitivity analysis, or that experiment, we can see how each of these performance metrics change as we increasingly improve the flow regime below the reservoir, right? So if we look at energy, eco-row, for example, this is one of our performance metrics. We can see that as we improve as we fill in this hole here in the hydrograph, our ecosystem performance, sorry, let me, yeah, that's right. Okay, sorry, this is ecosystem performance here, this dashed line. So our ecosystem performance stays about the same after a particular k value. We can see that our ecosystem performance, we can say it's ecological integrity, even though, remember I said that there are other factors as well, like temperature, sediment, et cetera. We can see after a while that improves significantly, but at the same time as that improves, we also see that our energy performance starts to decrease, at least in terms of reliability, right? So we start to see these trade-offs between the ecological integrity, nominally at least, and energy reliability. I'm not going to go into this, but we can create more fancy curves. We can vary, basically I did a more complex variation of what I just showed you. We can come up with different ways of exploring the trade-offs between these various environmental and hydropower factors, right? I've done a bunch of work in the Sierra Nevada, California. In the Sierra Nevada, California, water is managed for all the typical water uses, hydropower, water supply, flood control, ecosystems, recreation, other. The Sierra is losing its Nevada, so as the region warms up with climate warming, we see a shift in the hydrologic regime from snowmelt-driven runoff later in the year, in about April and June, or rather May and June, to more precipitation-driven runoff earlier in the year, in December and January, as the temperature increases. And so the questions are, for those trade-offs that we looked at below the Three Gorges Reservoir in the Yangtze River, what do these trade-offs look like if we throw climate change into the mix as we increase the temperature? I'm going to skip the modeling details and jump to this here again. You saw this previously, this is the mathematical model that I used to represent some of the in-stream flow requirements that we have in the river below, well, at various locations within the system, right? We have a minimum flow requirement, and what we're going to do is we're going to vary this minimum flow requirement in the river below various locations. We also have this down ramp rate constraint. So this variable here represents the rate of change that is allowable in the river below these several facilities within this particular system, right? And so what we can do is we can systematically change the minimum flow requirement and change the down ramp rate requirement to explore what the impacts are on hydropower generation and hydropower revenue under different climate scenarios. And so we can develop graphs like this, which show us, with these different combinations of ramping rate constraints and minimum in-stream flow requirement constraints, what are the impacts on hydropower generation and revenue as we go from delta T temperature of 0, which is the historical climate, all the way up to, say, 6-degree warming within that particular region. And I'm not going to get into the numbers here. The point is that this kind of trade-off and trade-off curve allows us to explore what the implications are of different environmental flow regimes within a river. What are the implications of those different flow regimes and flow regime combinations on hydropower generation? And we can discuss this with policymakers, with the hydropower operators, with fisheries, with fish interests, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd like to jump into what I see is what some of the more interesting research needs are in this field. I'll get into some of these, and this is kind of a short list. I think the list is actually could go to China from here. I mean, it's pretty exciting. I would say one research need is to incorporate artificial intelligence into environmental decision making. Artificial intelligence is a very hot topic nowadays, justifiably so, and I think that we need to think about how to incorporate that into e-flows. We should leverage information technologies such as big data, ubiquitous sensors, satellite data, cloud computing, et cetera, into environmental decision making. Environmental decision making generally, and environmental flows in particular. We should be thinking about developing decision support tools to facilitate rapid development of environmental flows and environmental flows assessments and water management generally, integrating big data and ubiquitous sensors, et cetera. Dynamic adaptation methods for deep uncertainty. I haven't really discussed deep uncertainty, but basically the idea behind deep uncertainty is that the future is unknown, and there are some unknown unknowns. There are some ways that the world is going to change, but we don't know what those ways are yet, and we don't exactly know what those variables are that are going to change, right? So given that deep uncertainty, deep uncertainty also means that we cannot necessarily quantify probabilistically or mathematically what that uncertainty looks like. And there are methods to account for that deep uncertainty that we should be thinking about applying in environmental flows. We should integrate all environmental water components, flow, sediment, nutrients, temperature, salinity, woody debris, et cetera, into our planning models. We don't currently integrate woody debris, for example, into our systems analysis models. Well, I mean, maybe somebody has, but typically we don't. And then we also need to integrate e-flows planning with other sectors,
food, energy, et cetera.
So I showed you this diagram earlier that shows the progression of environmental flows from the 90s all the way up to the present day. If we take those research needs from the previous slide and maybe some others and integrate them into this figure, if we look out from 2020 to 2030, say, I think that we certainly need to be thinking about how to integrate artificial intelligence into the decision-making process. What that looks like, I don't know yet. That's why it's in the next decade and not now. Again, big data, advanced simulation algorithms,
participatory modeling, web-based decision support systems, big computing, dynamic adaptation, and there are a lot of question marks as well. We need to be able to fill this in. Artificial intelligence, I mentioned this a little bit. I don't want to go too into this, other than to say I'm currently, as we speak, writing a proposal to the National Science Foundation in the United States to basically develop an algorithm to integrate deep reinforcement learning into this environmental flow decision challenge problem. And the reason I started thinking about this, I'll just tell you this briefly. Who here recognizes this problem? Have you heard of AlphaGo? Right. So AlphaGo is this artificial intelligence system developed by Google, I believe, or Google's parent, Alphabet, to play the game of Go. And AlphaGo eventually, and AlphaGo's successors more recently, have basically bested all human Go players in this game of Go. And it's done so in the game of chess as well. And so the idea is, well, if we can learn about the game of Go from applying AI in this fairly complex game, why can't we do that in environmental decision making, right? And we should be able to do that. And so there was a paper recently, Potentials and Promises of Computational Intelligence. I haven't talked about that for smart grids. So we're thinking about computational intelligence, artificial intelligence for smart grids, right? Electricity systems. We should be thinking about this for water systems as well, and in particular environmental systems, environmental flows. Decision support tools, I could talk a lot about this. I have developed an online decision support tool called OpenAgua with the goal of collaborative modeling and connecting global data sets ultimately for rapid site-specific analyses to help us solve some of these problems that I talked about. This is what I've been working on for the past 3 years. I haven't really talked about it much other than this slide in today, mainly because I'm kind of sick of talking about it. Every single presentation practically nowadays is about this. I'm super excited about it though, and I think that we do need to be thinking about, and other people recognize this problem as well, developing more accessible decision support systems for stakeholders in these environmental decision processes that we go through. Some of the key points from all this, these are my main messages, is that environmental water is important. I think we got that message. Environmental water design science has improved significantly over the past few decades. And it's not only the design science, it's also the decision-making science related to environmental flows. So that's, when I say decision-making science, I mean integrating, economics, politics, social, cultural values, et cetera. Systems analysis can help assess novel e-flows and e-flows trade-offs, between sectors. What are we giving up by increasing ecological integrity, right? We all use cell phones. Well, that cell phone use comes at a cost. And that cost, if we're getting the electricity from a power system that relies on hydropower, the cost of using the cell phone is potentially a degraded ecological system, right? And it's not only in rivers, it's also in other domains within, within the energy environment nexus as well, right? And the other key point here is my goals generally for those of you who are who might work with me in the future is to develop artificial intelligence methods for environmental water planning and management with deep uncertainty. And by the way, those AI methods they do use a lot of computing power, which costs a lot of energy. So it might be that in the process of developing those AI methods and applying those AI methods, we're also degrading the ecosystems at the same time. But if that helps us improve the ecosystem as well, then anyway, this problem that we're dealing with is, I don't want to use the word wicked, but it is a wicked problem. And then also to develop decision support tools to facilitate decision making in environmental water planning, right? And so I think that I was allocated 45 minutes, and I think I'm well over that time. And I think that hopefully we have some more time to take this discussion further. If there are any questions from you, that's definitely not all I have to say, but all I have to say right now, unless you have questions for me. So.
Thank you, David.
Well, thank you, David, for your presentation. And now, talking about the issue of environmental flows, what is the role of regulation in that matter? Because, for example, in Mexico, you know that we only have one standard regarding environmental flows, and it's not obligatory. It's just a recommended list of methods in order to calculate environmental flows. And so, I mean, in this sense, regulation is an obstacle to go further in this issue. What about in the United States? How is this matter managed?
For better or for worse, much of my work has been in California. And California is kind of a leader globally in some of these environmental challenges. Next week, I believe, is the Environmental Law Conference, the annual Environmental Law Conference in California, which I'm not going to, I've been to this law conference many times. One of the main things that I've learned from going to this law conference, I think about 3 or 4 times at this point, and also just knowing the history of the United States, is that one of the ways, so if you go back to the 1970s, Richard Nixon, early 1970s, United States, Richard Nixon is in power. This is before he left office, before he resigned. Despite his bad behavior, he was in power at a time when environmentalism in the United States was taking hold, right? And so Congress passed a wide range of national legislation in the United States, including the National Environmental Policy Act, the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, the Endangered Species Act, et cetera, et cetera. Those were all enacted in the early 70s. What happened was that these were all regulations that were on the books. Does that mean that we can all celebrate and go home and celebrate our clean air and clean water? Absolutely not. What happened was it took a dedicated group of lawyers to sue the US government to make sure that they actually implemented those laws that they had passed, right? When I say they, I mean the laws are passed by Congress. The lawyers and lawyer groups and legal entities such as the Sierra Club, such as the EDF, Environmental Defense Fund, there are other legal type organizations. They basically sued the executive branch for not enforcing those laws that Congress had passed. And the courts basically came in and agreed that the executive branch had to enforce these laws that Congress had passed. So I don't know if that solution would work here, but basically the answer to your question in the United States is the reason these are implemented, they're not just laws, they're actually implemented and enforced through legal action, right? And so I could talk more about that, but I think that's really so, and so I don't know. Now my question for you is, would that work here in Mexico? I mean, if you have these, if you have laws on the books that are more than just guidelines, could those laws be enforced through
do some kind of legal action.
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of topics we could be talking about. I'm not sure how much time we have, and I certainly appreciate your answer, and I think we can at least go back to that point regarding Mexico. I think we certainly do not have this litigation culture that exists in the US for good or bad. Certainly when it comes to environmental enforcement of environmental regulations, it's definitely a good thing. You can actually sue the federal government or the state government and obligate them to do the work. And Mexico, we're seeing some incipient activities in that direction. Seeing some lawsuits against the airport that has been proposed by President López Obrador, where many people agree this is environmentally wrong. It's wrong. But it's definitely more difficult in Mexico. NGOs are not as organized in the US. They're not as well funded. Sometimes it becomes dangerous to oppose plans, official plans. Routinely we have journalists are being killed for opposing projects, for divulging information. This is something we see all over Latin America and elsewhere. In the Amazon, of course, activists get killed all the time for protecting the environment. So the question is really about how do we deal with this? This is more mostly about understanding human psychology to start with, and how we as humanity we can use a peaceful approach to drive the changes we want to see. Why I'm saying this? Well, traditionally human development is about appropriating resources. And while as humanity we were small and organized in tribes, and we just could move somewhere else, we would get the resources we would need. And that's pretty much how humanity has worked for quite a long time. But we're obviously reaching the limits to this. There's nowhere else to move, and only Elon Musk is probably thinking about terraforming Mars and stuff like that. I mean, realistically, we have to continue to live on a finite planet with finite resources. So the one thing I would like to point out first, something I rescue from your presentation, is the fact that environmental flows are recognized as an objective is, of course, that's already a small success by itself. Because, and Aldo, I think he will probably not contradict me if I say this. In Mexico, it's still pretty unusual for environmental flows to be considered at all in any planning process. So basically, all water is for humankind for whatever purposes. So that's the one thing we have to start with. So the fact that environmental flows are considered at all is good. And if I understand you're thinking about relocating to Monterey, could bring some expertise to the table and become involved in this kind of activities, that would be great. Albert can probably tell you that we already have this decision theater in the water center. I'm not involved in this, but I know they've done great work, and it's certainly something that can be built upon. And this is also science-based, and this is fact-based. You basically run simulations for different scenarios, and you show the stakeholders. These are the outcomes. And I think that's been a great project with public participation here in Monterey, particularly the Monterey water plan. This is something where really your expertise would be great, and this is certainly I would like to link a question to, but I will finish in 1 minute. Okay, let's skip to the question. Are you aware of the specific problematics here in Monterey and northeastern Mexico regarding environmental flows or water availability at all? I didn't see that on your to-do list. I mean, many of the things could fit in this process, but are you at all aware of the Monterey water plan, of the proposals that have been made in the past, the specific issues on the Monterey area, on the northeastern area?
Short, I have not read the Monterey water plan. I'm familiar with some of the issues here.
related to like water supply, for example, and I sort of alluded to that. I mean, if you look at the past trend of water supply usage in Monterey, it just goes up and up and up and up. And my understanding is that it is a real concern, like immediate concern right now. I know that there were some plans to build like Monterey 6, for example. So I'm generally aware of that, and I'm aware of some of the studies that were done in the region to explore ways to help resolve some of the water supply issues without Monterey 6. So
Yeah.
But I haven't read the exact.
Okay, yeah, I was not thinking that you would be specifically aware of this. My question was a little bit in another direction. You talked about trade-offs, and of course, if you allow for environmental flows, you lose somewhere else. And the idea is, of course, to keep those trade-offs at kind of an optimal region. But after all, these trade-offs have to consider also the possibility that we have kind of demand-side management. So far, our economy has basically evolved with a paradigm that everything is allowed, everything goes, whatever you need. If you need a huge data center to store millions of photographs nobody needs, then it just somebody demands it, so we have to provide the energy for that, and we have to provide the resource. If it makes sense, or if it's even dangerous because you get a genocide in some parts of the world because people are allowed to post violence online and stuff, it's never questioned. It's just, there's a demand for the service, and we as infrastructure guys, we have to provide for these services, and that's pretty much it. Of course, we're not going anywhere. We're hitting a roadblock by this mentality. So demand-side management is something that has to come in, and I think in water we're probably at the one resource where this becomes more urgent. And well, you mentioned Monterey 6. This was clearly a supply-side solution, so to speak. And I think the NGO participation here in Monterey has helped a lot to reframe the whole thing. I don't know. Is there any thinking about demand-side management in California? You said you were you're spearheading basically the global trend. Is there some thinking about how to manage demand, how to use demand-side management to?
Yeah, I mean, I could talk a bit about that. My inclination is to talk about environmental flow, so I purposely didn't talk about that. I mean, I think that there are some things that translate very well from one place to another, say from California or the United States to Europe or wherever to a place like here. I think, if you talk about like household infrastructure, for example, they're kind of low-hanging fruit that we can implement. For example, I'm staying in an Airbnb right now. During my time there, I actually went from a very large shower head to a very small shower head for reasons unrelated to reducing water supply, but the effect is that I actually cannot use more than like a very small amount of water for my shower. So, I mean, there are some like physical infrastructure, things like that, like more efficient toilets, et cetera, that are actually quite relatively easy to implement. Rainwater harvesting is another huge one. I mean, we have huge storms here in Monterey, but a lot of that water just runs off into the river. Now, that water is potentially, one of the points from the Brisbane Declaration is that water flowing to the sea is not wasted. But in this case, we can think of water flowing to the sea as wasted if the alternative is going to 2,000 kilometers away to get our water. So rainwater harvesting, I mean, there are a lot of demand-side management options that we can think of, related to that. One thing that I think that might not work so well, but that is also related to infrastructure, I don't know, this is more of a question, is more water recycling, gray water, purple pipes. It's very easy to think of the Bay Area as implementing like a new set of pipes throughout the urban area to recycle their water and use it for maybe non-potable uses such as irrigation for people's backyards, for landscaping. That, cost-wise, infrastructure-wise, I mean, that's a major undertaking. I don't know if Monterey could afford that, like financially. The other thing, though, that I want to mention is the role of, and this isn't exactly related, but I think is very relevant, is the role of the private sector in water management generally. This is not only for water supply, but also for environmental water as well. You know, I don't know the mechanistic details of how Fondos de Agua works, but I think that this idea of bringing the international or the NGO sector together with the private sector to implement you know, improved water management, not only in upland areas, but also below you know, reservoirs potentially, I think is critical. You know, there is more money in the private sector, especially here in Monterey, and they need to be part of that conversation. And they also need to be part of that conversation in terms of both designing the system, but also in terms of implementing and enforcing that as well. And I know that there is some history here in Monterey with the private sector being involved in enforcement in, I think.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Could you please repeat?
Sorry. Siri, hi, how are you doing? So I know that the private sector here has been involved in terms of just general urban security generally in the past, and they could be involved in other aspects of security as well and enforcement. So, you know, I think that there's no one straight answer that I have for that, but you know, my experience in the Bay Area, I do know that they are thinking a lot about a lot of these things, and you know, some things transfer well, some things don't. The idea of recycling, though, actually, the more I think about it, I want to think about this some more, but I think that maybe Monterey, as a very industrial urban center, I mean, industry runs through the veins of Monterey. Maybe something like recycled water could work here. I don't know. Like if you look at Orange County, California, or San Diego, they are moving forward with plans to recycle human waste for drinking water. They have to. It's not toilet to tap. It's not necessarily directly from the treatment plant. You know, to people's houses. You know, it might go through some groundwater filtration process, but they are doing it. And so, you know, could Monterey be a test bed for something like that in Latin America?
I think we have another question.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. I have a question about managing in the future, because I think models now are based on historical data, but how can we prepare models for actual changes that are going to happen with climate change? You know, having how I think water distribution around the world is going to change, and how the weather is going to affect these different storms coming up in places where we are not expecting it, and how can we start reshaping the way we do models. And maybe
I'm going to answer that, but not answer it at the same time. This is where I think, basically the question is, we don't know. But however, having said that, we have the tools, and we can build the tools to be able to help answer that. And so this is where simulation modeling comes into play. This is where optimization comes into play. Right? We have the capacity to build advanced computational tools to explore a wide range of different management options, and even, you know, say with artificial intelligence, for example, to suggest options that we might not have thought of yet, right? So I'm not going to say that these are some of the options that we could implement, even though we could sit here and come up with a bunch of different ideas. But again, you know, to reiterate the point that you know, as researchers, I think that this is one of our key roles as engineers, as modelers, et cetera, is to be able to help answer those kinds of questions. Not only by ourselves in our own offices, on our own computers, but as ongoing dialogues and in consultation with basically everybody who has some interest in, you know, managing our resources.
I guess we ran out of time. I would like to thank you, David, for your presentation, and all of you for assisting to this seminar. So
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.